About a year and a half ago, when I was talking with Roger about, putting a summer content institute together, focusing on the First Amendment, he had mentioned to me that he knew some pretty famous people. People who really kind of made a difference in what the First Amendment means to us. And you're going to hear a lot from them tomorrow, but they are here tonight to just kind of give you a little teaser, an introduction to themselves. So I don't want to take too much time, but if Roger, you would like to make a formal introduction to our featured guests?
We can advance to the front of the room so people don't have to get sprained necks.
So glad to be here. Sit. Roger? Should we sit? Okay.
No particular order.
Well, welcome everyone. Is it on? It usually does. Let me also acknowledge our thanks to Pearson's to provide us this reception for this evening. That was very kind and very much appreciated. But I also want to thank the John Adams Courthouse, in particular Barbara Berenson, whom many of you have simply just met, giving you this incredible tour of this incredible building. As we were coming up from the hotel, we had a chance to kind of talk about the fact that the history and the social studies are taking a back seat to our education. Today, what you're going to be hearing is, in my opinion, something that our students and we have to know about. This is our history. They were part of that history. And so I think it's essential for our students to be able to have the ability and the opportunity to be able to understand all of these incredible landmark decisions in this case, the fact that we have books in which we discuss and talk about teen rights and what they are able to understand with regard, in particular, with the First Amendment. So we're delighted that you were able to join us today, despite some inconveniences along the way. Poor Kathy was rerouted to here and was supposed to be here just before noon, but arrived about 5 minutes before 4. So some of us in this room have probably had similar types of experiences with our airlines, but we're really glad that you were able to make it on time, and thank you for that. I also want to thank the Massachusetts Council for the Social Studies through Gorman and others to help put this together. Yes, Gorman and I had lots of discussions and talks that we just essentially need and believe that professional development for history and social science teachers is essential. We just don't get enough. And certainly our school districts don't always think it's enough. So as a result, we're very, very pleased that the persistence, and I would have to say the vision that Gorman has brought to the Mass Council has been essential as we go forward and hopefully make some inroads and make some corrections for the errors of perhaps the last 10 or so years. Now, the people that you've come to listen to, not me, are before you. And Mary Beth Tinker, John Tinker, Kathy Kohlmeyer-Fry, and David Hudson. What I'd like to do, because we don't want to steal their thunder for tomorrow. Tomorrow we want to have them discuss, their cases and how they developed and came to be. But I do think that we have a few questions and a few things that we might be able to discuss with them this evening. And that is, I'd like to start off with a question, and you can take it from there. But the bottom line is, what was the background to your cases? How did these cases come to be? And what were some of the things that occurred that ended up bringing it to the forefront of our history? So I will start with you, Mary Beth, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. Thank you for arranging all of this, and to Gorman and to all of you. We're so happy to be with all of you teachers, our kindred spirits. I know that I can speak for all of us to say that we feel that way. Should I say, well, for John and I, our case, and I'm going to let him talk more about it, but we were living in mighty times, just like now. That's the way a student described the times that we live in right now, today. Recently, when I was at American University at the law school there, and I was talking about these times that we lived in when people were standing up for justice and equality and all of the democratic ideals that we hold. But young people especially were pushing it forward. And one of the students said, yeah, mighty times, just like now. And it was a time much like today. So I'm going to just leave it at that for now and let John take over and tell a little bit more about the details. But don't tell them about that time I held you down and started speaking. Okay, all right, okay, yeah, that's it. Nothing, no, nothing. That's all right.
Hi. Yes, thank you, Roger, for putting this together and for the association and for you all for being here. It's an honor to us to be able to attend this, and we really enjoy it and are happy to be here speaking with you. In terms of the circumstances that led to our case, I really almost have to start back with World War II, honestly, because our parents, Mary Beth and my parents, were young adults during World War II, and they both became pacifists. My father was a pacifist and a Methodist minister, and in World War II, to be a pacifist was to be among a very small minority. Our mother grew up in South Texas and had witnessed racial discrimination. She attended Vanderbilt for a while and became really interested in the issue of racial justice. So in the early 50s, our father got an appointment in a small town in Iowa, Atlantic, Iowa, to be the pastor there. There was one black family in town, and their kids were not permitted to use the swimming pool. This was in 1954, 1955. So the church youth group, of which our mother was the adult leader, took it on themselves to try to persuade the town council to do away with the rule that wasn't permitting the black kids to swim in the swimming pool. And instead of just correcting the matter and moving on, there was resistance in the town to doing that. And our father was accused of being divisive in the church congregation, and his contract wasn't renewed. And so he had to look for work elsewhere and found a church in Des Moines, Iowa. So in 1957, we moved to Des Moines, Iowa. And our mother, in Atlantic, Iowa, us kids were not friends with the black kids. We just didn't know them. We didn't have interaction with them. But when we got to Des Moines, our mother made sure that we had black friends. And we did. We developed lifelong friendships with black kids in Des Moines, and that we're still in touch with. And we invited these kids to come to our church. And the same sort of thing happened. The church congregation had never had black people in their church before, and so they also didn't renew our father's contract. And so our father was really disheartened, and I remember seeing him one evening. He was in his 40s at the time, and he was saying, "My life is half over and I'm a failure." Because his plan was that you'd preach the gospel and people would pick up on it, and you'd have the kingdom of heaven would be created on earth, that that's the project that he was engaged in. Not that he expected it to happen like that, but that he was going to be progressively headed in that direction, and now nothing seemed to be working out for him. But fortunately, there's a Quaker organization called the American Friends Service Committee. It's sort of the service arm of the Quaker religion. And they hired our father to be the Peace Education Secretary for the North Central region of the United States. And that was like a perfect job for our dad. So his job then was to organize speaking tours, symposiums, family camps. In the summer, we'd go for a week and hear world affairs experts talk about what's going on in the world. And then in the evening, we'd sing folk songs and kids would play games and all of that. So it was a really great job for him. And us kids kind of tagged along to these events. So we'd help out with the literature table. We'd unpack the boxes and pack them up at the end. And so we were acquainted with the issues that were being discussed in the early 1960s regarding war and peace and social justice and economic justice and things like that. So when the Vietnam War started to really heat up in February of 1965, the U.S. began a major bombing campaign called Rolling Thunder. And this was flying the big, heavy bombers, the B-52s, dropping bombs all over North Vietnam. There was a lot of concern in the peace community over this at the time. And by that fall, Thanksgiving time, there were plans for a national demonstration against the war to happen in Washington, D.C., around the Washington Monument. In Iowa, there were 2 charter buses that college students had chartered to go to that demonstration, and I asked my parents if I could go too, and they agreed that I could go along. So we went to this big demonstration. It was amazing. I was from Iowa. I'd really never seen a city, I'll be honest with you. I mean, Des Moines is sort of a city, but not really, and at the time. And to see 30, 40, maybe 50,000 people all together around the Washington Monument, and all sharing more or less my point of view with regard to the war, to move from being just this little sliver of a minority opinion against the war to being surrounded by people that also agreed. It was a great affirmation of the peace position. On the bus ride back, there was a discussion on the bus of how we might continue to oppose the war and let people know, and to try to stir up conversation about the war. It was really what we wanted to do, to try to get a discussion going among the citizenry. And a man suggested that we wear black armbands. And so there were 4 of us on the bus from a Unitarian youth group that I also belonged to. And we took it to the youth group, and they all decided to wear armbands. And so that was the genesis of the armband situation. I'm going to pass it to Kathy, and Kathy can tell you her experience. So when our case was decided in 1969, there was sort of a feeling of now students have all these rights. But then there were subsequent cases that kind of trimmed the edge off of those rights that our case established. And one of those cases was Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeier, and Kathy Kuhlmeier-Frey was the litigant in that. So here's Kathy.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for putting this together. It's always an honor to be able to come and talk about our experiences and also to catch up with old friends. So in 1983, I was on our newspaper staff, or I was the wannabe, because it was the precursor to actually getting to be a real journalist, so I thought. And in Journalism 1, we learned about what it was like to be a journalist. We talked about prior restraint. We talked about the Tinker Standard. And I learned that students do not shed their rights at the schoolhouse gate. So now second semester rolls around, and I get to be the layout editor of our paper. So I thought, yay, big stuff. And we had talked about, a lot of our school paper was fluff, but we wanted to do something a little more intensive, so we decided to look through our morgue of stories, and we wanted to update and put a new spin on some topics, and this is an important thing, that had actually previously been run. However, our attorney, being all that she was, failed to mention that, so it was kind of an issue. But the story topics were on teen pregnancy. They were about divorce, marriage, runaways, pregnancy, things that are relevant then. Strangely enough, they still are now, right? I'm the proud mama of a high school senior this year. I'm excited. And he will be the newspaper editor as well. Think his advisor isn't a little bit intimidated at this point. Because for years going, before my daughter graduated high school, I would go in and I would talk to the class, and just, it's in the kids' books. They study it. At least they do in Missouri. And so I would get to go and I would talk to these kids and go, this is my story. Well, now we have this new advisor. And so my son's going, well, this is my mom. And she's like, yeah, whatever. And I don't know if she didn't believe him or what. So I didn't go this year. I wasn't invited to come and talk. And I'll tell you more about a very controversial issue we had this year. And I think I put the fear of God in this woman at this point already. And my son's not even the editor, and until this term starts. But we wanted to do these stories because they were relevant. In my high school back in the 80s, we had a daycare, so there was a teen pregnancy problem, and we wanted to make kids aware of choices. But our principal, bless his heart, Mr. Reynolds, said that it was too controversial, and kids our age, the topics were too mature for an immature audience. We weren't old enough to understand. And I was kind of a bit outspoken, like I still am now. And when we went to meet with him after the paper was censored, I asked him, if you're old enough to get pregnant, shouldn't you probably be old enough to read about it? That didn't sit so well. But the question needed to be asked, so I did. And from there, it just kind of rolled on that we disagreed with his decision to not run the articles, and we pushed the limit on it. And because it was a different case, from what the justices were seeing, they picked it up and took it, and it's still relevant today. Last year I went to North Dakota and we spoke, and we're working on getting new laws called the New Voices Acts pass. North Dakota did pass theirs. It didn't make it in Missouri yet, but by golly, we're trying. It didn't make it through the Senate, but we gave it a good run. So hopefully we're going to get more rights reinstored for the journalists, because ultimately that's our goal, is to educate our students, because if they can't speak up and get a good education now, how are they going to ever become a journalist in life in the real world? Our society will be losing a very important niche of people. So that's my story.
Thank you very much for whetting everyone's appetite for tomorrow. We're thrilled, to hear the guts, if you will, of your case and how your cases came to be. At this point, I want to ask David to come up. I first met David over 10 years ago, and David was then working at the First Amendment Center in Nashville, Tennessee, and he's been a scholar for the We the People programs and institutes for many, many years. And David, I'd like to allow you to kind of speak to your background and how you got to the point where you became a voice for teen rights.
Well, thank you so much, Roger and Dr. Lee. It's just a great honor for me to be involved in anything affiliated with We the People and civic education, and particularly with the Tinker and Hazelwood cases. You're going to hear from, obviously you've already heard from them somewhat, the litigants in what I would consider to be the two most important student speech cases that we've ever had. And that's the way it is today. The Tinker ruling of February 24th, 1969 has been described as the Brown versus Board of Education for students. Justice A. Fortas wrote that it can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, that schools are not enclaves of totalitarianism, that students are not closed-circuit recipients for only that information that school officials wish to impart. Before that Tinker ruling in 1969, there really was no consistent standard that helped school officials determine and students to know when their speech was protected and when it was not protected. It's a seminal ruling. It's still the leading case in student speech jurisprudence. I came to appreciate this case because I felt that I was unfairly censored when I was in high school. So that was my passion for developing an interest in student speech rights. I followed that passion to a place called the First Amendment Center in Nashville, Tennessee. It was founded by a man named John Siegenthaler Sr., who was a special advisor to Robert Kennedy when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General. And Mr. Siegenthaler encouraged me to try to continue my studies and learn about freedom of expression and student speech rights. And as much as I appreciate the Tinker decision, I was horrified by the majority decision in the Hazelwood case, which I think was a 5-3 decision. The Hazelwood decision applies for school-sponsored student speech as opposed to student-initiated speech. And it sets up a standard that is something to the effect of educators do not offend the First Amendment by exercising editorial control of the style and content of school-sponsored expressive activities, so long as their reasons for doing so are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns. All that, as we know, all that legal mumbo-jumbo, reasonably related to legitimate educational concerns, which is just about anything. And in fact, in Justice White's opinion in Hazelwood, he said a legitimate pedagogical concern was divorcing the school from any position other than neutrality on controversial political topics, which turns the First Amendment on its head. And that's why I'm so happy to support what Kathy and Mary Beth and John are doing in supporting and trying to pass laws like you have in Massachusetts, so-called anti-Hazelwood laws. It's important. The Hazelwood decision essentially adopts, in my mind, a prison inmate model for student rights. I began to, I kept reading these cases, and then I thought, well, why not reach out and see whatever happened to these individuals? I read a great book by John Johnson, The Struggle for Student Rights, about the Tinker case. And, to my great amazement, I reached out to all 3 of these individuals, and they're just great people. They're willing to talk about their cases. They're willing they put their money where their mouth is. They really live and breathe the First Amendment. And that's why I'm so honored to be a part of any conference that talks about these cases. My thesis for tomorrow essentially is that not only are student speech rights not protected enough, neither are public school teacher free speech rights protected enough. Because in 2006, in a case called Garcetti versus Ceballos, the United States Supreme Court essentially held that when public employees make statements pursuant to their official job duties, they have no First Amendment protection, no matter how important a whistleblower they are. And so that's really my passion, is trying to advocate for greater free speech rights for public school students and also greater free speech rights for public school teachers. Thank you.
My understanding is that the mics in front of you should be sufficient, and perhaps it'll be easier for you to respond to the next question without too much difficulty. And so I do have another follow-up question that I'd like each of you to discuss, if you could, and that is, since your case, what effect or impact has it had on your lives? Not to exclude the time that immediately followed but also throughout your careers and your lives. And if you could give us an insight as to how you were impacted.
This case really defined my life in many ways. I didn't know it at the time, but I had no idea that the case was going to be so important. And so I went on with my life as a teenager. I was a junior in high school when it was decided. And then eventually I went to nursing school. I still had no idea. And I saw the case in my nursing school book, Tinker versus Des Moines. I was studying for an exam in my nursing class, and there's our case. And I think that might have been one of the first times it really hit me how important this case was. And that's when I found out that nurses need to know about it, because it's really about children's rights and youth rights. And I found out that law students learn about the case, and teachers and administrators in schools. And I learned that there's an international movement for students' rights and youth rights and children's rights, and that I started to see our case in this context. And it's had a huge effect on my life. I work with children anyway. I became mostly a pediatric nurse, so I would have been around kids a lot anyway because I like kids. But because of this case, I've learned to see the life of children in terms of rights and their power to have a voice and not have a voice too often. And so it's affected my life hugely.
Yeah, first I neglected to mention that I actually brought 2 public school students with me today. I'd like to introduce my daughter Kaya, who is 16 and will be a junior, and my son Fisher, who is going on 12 and will be in 6th grade this year. I have to say, other than coming to occasions such as this one, the case has not really impacted my life directly very much. The peace movement, however, has impacted my life, and growing up in a peace movement family has impacted my life. I spent 4 years, or parts of 4 years, in Nicaragua during the Contra War time, shipping medical supplies, bicycles, sewing machines, and clothing through a Quaker organization in Florida. And then I spent time in Nicaragua working on that. I've been very interested in world affairs and remain very interested. I've built a website that is news feeds on different topics. It extracts a news feed and presents it for the user, and I'm going right on 20,000 topics. So I stay real interested in international affairs and national affairs, and I really enjoy coming out now and then to speak to groups such as yourselves.
I think for me, it's just really formed me into a person that I'm not afraid to speak up. If I find that something is not right, I'm not afraid to challenge it. And I think a good example of it is when my son was born, he had a cleft palate and he required a special bottle to be able to eat. And the insurance company told me it wasn't medically necessary. So my child was failure to thrive because he couldn't eat because of the cleft. And I challenged him on it and I won. So I'm like, you don't know who you're dealing with. And again, as I mentioned earlier with my son's teacher, she's going to have her hands full this year with me. I promise you that, as the background that I have, and I've shaped my son into the same person that he's not afraid to speak up and challenge things. I'm not shy. I mean, if I don't believe something, then I ask why. And bless her heart, my daughter is just nonstop chatterbox at 22, and she's the same way. So watch out, world.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not a Supreme Court litigant, but the cases have been very central to my work at the First Amendment Center. So student speech has always been a passion of mine, and I love going to speak to different groups of students and public school teachers and administrators.
Thank you very much. Last question for tonight, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. The question, I think, is, as you're speaking before a room full of teachers, what do you see as the importance and the impact that your cases or your vision for the First Amendment ought to be, and how can they better address this in their classrooms with their students?
I want to use to.
You know, this election cycle especially, we're seeing a great amount of tension among the American people. The division into major camps that are like oil and water. The polarization to me seems extreme. And I think that the First Amendment can be taken to be the keystone, really, to our society, to our political society, to the polity, and that the ability to communicate with each other, to express an idea, and the need to listen to each other. It's a two-way street, but there's nothing really that I can think of that's more essential to a democratic society than to be able to express what we think and to be able to receive, to hear what other people are thinking. And so I know Mary Beth and I are extremely proud to be associated with a case that speaks directly to that issue. And so from me to you, it's in your hands to let students know how important it is that they learn how to express themselves and that they learn how to listen to other people. To me, it's just essential to the society. So those are my thoughts.
I would ask you a question. Are any of you a journalism teacher?
Oh, gotcha. So,
Believe in your kids. Support them. Know that if they run a controversial story, support them. Give them that background that if you take questions from an administration, you're going to be there to support your kids. I can't say that experience is vast, but it is so very important to believe in your youth. Give them that opportunity that you believe in them. Make them empowered.
Yeah, I think the First Amendment is our blueprint for personal liberty. It's essential to a fully functioning constitutional democracy. I think the way that I've found to be more successful, at least in my classes, is to engage students oftentimes by telling them stories of censorship.
There are so many.
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, these are the seminal ones, but there are all sorts of controversies all across the country. And the other thing I think is important to convey is that oftentimes the First Amendment gets judged by the shabby contemporary company that it keeps, right? We hear about the First Amendment when it involves a flag burner or somebody advertising tobacco or the Westboro Baptist Church or such and such. But I think it's important to realize that the First Amendment was an important galvanizing tool for social progress, right? The First Amendment was essential to the so-called rampant women in the 19-teens and led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. The First Amendment was absolutely essential in the 1950s and the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement. The First Amendment was absolutely essential in the culmination of what ultimately led to Obergefell. So to me, I think that oftentimes the First Amendment gets a bad rap. And I think too often many people, including school principals, tend to operate in the mindset, to quote Nat Hentoff, free speech for me, but not for thee. And we need to, in a free society, be willing to listen to controversial or different viewpoints and viewpoints that we disagree with. Because if there's one fundamental First Amendment free speech principle, is that we should not engage in viewpoint discrimination, which ultimately was one facet of the Tinker case, right? You're going to censor this black armband, but you're going to allow students to wear other symbols. That's viewpoint discrimination.
Well, I would just say, yes, I would second what everyone said about the First Amendment, and a lot of times I talk to students, and I'm sure a lot of you do also, that the First Amendment is about respecting each other and listening to each other, and I love to review the right to freedom of religion, and I ask the kids, can we be Buddhists in the United States? Can we be atheists? Can we be Muslim? And, you know, making it relevant, which I'm sure a lot of you are already doing, and the controversies in the classrooms, bringing controversy into the classroom. It's been shown, and there's a woman named Diana Hess, I'm sure a lot of you know about her, who specializes in controversy in the classroom and how important it is to make the classroom relevant, and that means controversy a lot of times, and be examples yourselves as teachers, as you stand up for your rights, because they are very much tied together. When times are good for students' rights, they're usually good for teachers' rights also. And when times are bad for students' rights, like now, it's usually not a good time for teachers' rights either. So to be an example, I think, is also very important yourselves to stand up for your rights as teachers.
Thank you very much. Do any of you have questions that you'd like to ask tonight? Yes, David.
Hi, thank you. I'm so honored to be part of today's conversation. I actually was lucky enough and fortunate enough to meet you, both Kathy and Mary Beth, in St. Louis at the National Social Studies Conference, and it was a great moment. My kids in my school have wondered, obviously with Hazelwood and obviously with Tinker, it was a long, lengthy time ago, 65, 69, it's 83. Now we've got social media. In your own experience, having seen the origin and the metamorphosis of kids using social media, do you find that has helped your cause about First Amendment, or has there been certain rights and responsibilities that have been neglected? I'm just curious, what can I tell?
I personally think it's great, social media, for the First Amendment, because, and it's also been good for some administrators who have found a way to embrace it, because they realize if I'm going to censor this, it's just going to go out on a tweet, or, it could. But on the other hand, there's a lot of censoring of social media that takes place out of school. And I know David's going to get into some of this too tomorrow, these issues with out-of-school speech and social media that are going on. But I personally think social media is wonderful for the First Amendment.
There have been studies on social media that show that we tend to clump up with people that we already agree with in social media. But accepting that tendency, I also agree, it's a wonderful thing. For it's much easier to get a conversation. We note that the National Security Agency also is part of the conversation, but I think that people don't care that much, and I think it's really wonderful to see people saying what they think, and sometimes working it out and sometimes not, but I think it's fine regardless.
Adam?
My question to the thinkers, do you still have your armbands?
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, well, I took my armband after I got back to school that Christmas, after we were suspended. It was 1965, and so we had to write a report. I was in 8th grade on what did you do over Christmas vacation. So mine was on wearing the armband, and I pasted my armband in there, and then I found the report in a box in the basement about 5 or 10 years, 10 years ago or so. So it ended up at the museum in Washington, D.C., which is really crazy. Our sister is still laughing about that one. And some of our hate mail is there, too. Yeah.
Real quick, Captain, regarding the anti-Hazelwood bill, I wasn't familiar with that, but I looked it up quickly. You said North Dakota.
Illinois just passed last week.
How's that working? Because I could see how that empowers First Amendment rights for students and teachers as well. But is that being taking away certain rights or powers from the administrative or teacher end of things? Because they won't be able to censor
I think it's finding a common ground that they can all agree on, that, you know, it will give you a little bit of this if you know, it's a two-way street on it, really, is what's been happening on it. Yeah, the administration has to come back a little bit, but I think also in today's times, I think they're seeing that the Supreme Court got it wrong. And I think that's the biggest thing for us, is that they messed it up.
So is there anticipated a higher, like a sort of SCOTUS-bound fight with this to test this?
David?
It would seem that it would have to get to that level because it's going to confront the 83 decision. Right?
Well, let me just add too quickly that the Journalism Education Association, which I think has about 5,000 members, and also the Society of Professional Journalists, both came out with statements last year saying that censorship of the student press is not good journalism education. So in high schools, the students and the advisors, in order for it to be state-of-the-art journalism education, those should be the ones deciding what the articles are, not the principal, who probably has very, very little experience in journalism education. So that's kind of given a big wind in the sails to the whole movement also lately.
You know, when you get a negative U.S. Supreme Court ruling with regard to individual rights, there are a couple avenues that possibly can be taken. One avenue, of course, is the sort of the anti-Hazelwood movement, right? Is to pass a statute or a law that provides greater protection. The other avenue is interpreting your own individual state constitution to provide greater protection for freedom of expression than the U.S. Supreme Court has done in interpreting the U.S. Constitution. So the analogy that's often used in constitutional law, right, is that the U.S. Constitution sets a floor of liberty, but a state high court is always free to interpret its own individual provision in its state constitution to provide greater protection.
And that takes precedence because I thought there was a federal law, but that's...
Well, it's state high courts have the ability to interpret their state constitution as long as it does not conflict with the baseline of liberty established by the U.S. Supreme Court. So, for instance, in Tennessee, we don't have any extra protection for freedom of expression under Article 1, Section 19 of the Tennessee Constitution, but we often have greater protection in the Fourth Amendment context under Article 1, Section 7 of the Tennessee Constitution. And so there's some states that have been very protective of freedom of expression in their state constitution: Oregon, New Jersey, some of these states.
There are 9 states now that have legislation that say that our students in our state are going to go by the Tinker standard. Unless it's substantially disruptive or impinges on the rights of others, the student speech should be protected. Well, and then there are the lewd and obscene, but as far as and that we're not going by the Hazelwood standard. So there are 9 states, and Massachusetts is one of them.
Eric?
I always cringe, but I understand whenever I see school administration or security personnel go through a student's possessions, belongings, and whatnot. And I'm curious to know your take on what could be perceived as a violation of students' rights with regards to security.
Do you want to talk about yours?
Well, you know, the short answer is the U.S. Supreme Court in a case right before the Matthew Frazier case, New Jersey versus TLO in 1985, established a fairly low deferential standard for school administrators. It's essentially a reasonableness type standard. The court did curtail that somewhat in the Savannah-Redding case in 2009's Redding versus Safford Unified School District, where the court ruled that it did violate the Fourth Amendment to engage in a strip search of a middle school student who was alleged to have had prescription ibuprofen. The Fourth Amendment, or search and seizure law, does happen to be an area where there has been significant movement on state constitutional law fronts. And so we often will see that, usually with regard to random drug testing of students, which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld for student athletes in Vernonia, and then also for all students engaged in extracurricular activities in the Lindsay Earls case. But there have been several state high courts that have rejected certain forms of drug testing because that is considered to be a seizure of an individual. And I certainly think, in my opinion in talking to students, they are very much engaged with regard to their protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. But on the other hand, when we do live in the age where there have been some horrific school shootings, where there are guns brought on campus, where there are illegal narcotics, a lot of courts have been very deferential to administrators in this regard.
Very good. Well, you've whet our appetite for tomorrow, and I expect that there'll be a lot more information that everyone will be able to A, share, and B, receive. So this has been great, and our thanks for your being here for these next couple of days and for sharing your stories.
Thank you. So good.
I'd like to acknowledge a couple more people that are here that I failed to mention before. You, all four of you, may recognize Mike Trophy. He and I were in Long Island when we heard you all speak there. And Mike is the head of our James Madison Legacy Project, which is a seed grant that's allowing us to do more professional development for our civic education teachers.
Important.
And so he's a huge fan, and he does an incredible amount of work, especially in Rhode Island, but even in the other states too. And in the back, I hope that you'll have the opportunity to meet with Professor Bob Allison. He's our Suffolk University lecturer and contact, and he does an incredible job on the First Amendment. And he and Gorman and I and Mike have worked pretty hard in putting this all together. But Bob spent the whole day today with everyone in the Massachusetts Council for the Social Studies group discussing freedom of religion and the aspects of free exercise in the Establishment Clause. So my guess is that you will all have some great conversation with regard to the First Amendment. And lastly, if I can, I'd like to introduce Ed O'Connell from the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. He is the manager of the museum initiatives and also civic engagement. We are privileged to be able to go there on Thursday to engage and to learn more about this phenomenally new institution that has received tremendous amount of positive press and positive reaction from everyone, not just here in Massachusetts, but all around the country. And thank you, Ed, for gracing us tonight with your presence and your support. Please continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.